Okay. This is a shir on Likutei Sichos, book 21, Chelek Chafalef, the Sicha of Boy, the third Sicha, regarding the mitzvah of telling about the going out of Egypt on the night of Pesach. The Rambam says it's a mitzvah, say a positive mitzvah of the Torah, lesaper b'nisim v'niflaot, to talk about, to relate the miracles and wonders shenasu l'avoteinu b'Mitzrayim that were done to our forefathers in Egypt on the eve of the 15th day of Nisan. As it says, where is the biblical imperative? Where is the tzivui, the instruction of the Torah, to remember on the night of Pesach, going out of Egypt? Remember this day that you went out of Egypt. And then the Rambam, as if somehow it's not clear enough, the verse that says, remember this day that you went out of Egypt, it seems to be a pretty clear instruction. The Rambam says, we have another place where we have a similar instruction which tells about, which sheds light, as it says elsewhere, remember the day of Shabbos. So the question that the commentators of the Rambam ask, what does the Rambam need to bring? What does he mean when he brings a verse that says, remember Shabbos? What's not enough in telling us that it's a mitzvah to remember, to talk about the miracles of going out of Egypt with the pasuk that says, remember this day? What does the comparison to remembering the day of Shabbos add to this instruction about remembering? How does it shed any light or give any more depth to the instruction about remembering Pesach, going out of Egypt? That's question number one. Question number two, if we do need this this other comparison to Pesach, to Shabbos, what is the Rambam's source? Remember, the Rambam is a compiler of information, halacha, from previous sources, where he doesn't just bring a backup pasuk because he decided. Where's the source that there's a correlation between remembering going out of Egypt and remembering Shabbos? So paragraph 2 says that Rabbi, in the Sefer HaMitzvahs, you see the Rambam has a Sefer Hayad, which is called the book of Mishneh Torah, the book of where he compiles all the halachas. There's also a compilation of the Rambam that's called Sefer HaMitzvot, the book of mitzvahs. So there he brings just the mitzvahs in a more encapsulated form. What does the Rambam say there? Quote, the language of the Medrash called Mechilta, the halachic, agadic material called Mechilta, similar to Mishnah, says, what does the Mechilta say? Michlal shenema ki shalcha bincha. Because the Torah says, when your child asks, you should answer him. Says the Mechilta, one may think, you only respond to the question of a child, but what happens if you don't have a child or the child doesn't ask you? Maybe that means you don't have an obligation, one would think, to say the story of Pesach at night. You only have to make a seder if you have a kid asking a question. No. Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says, the pasuk says, you have to tell your child, even if he doesn't ask you. Okay, but that's to tell your child. What if you don't even have a child? How do you know you have to, even if you're alone, you have to have a seder by yourself and talk about going out of Egypt, even to yourself or to anyone else that's there that maybe not is not your child? So Talmud Lomar, the Torah tells us, Moshe told the people, remember this day. And then the Rambam says, in other words, Hashem is telling us to remember going out of Egypt, just like it says, remember the day of Shabbos. So here, in this context, way the Rambam teaches it, he starts off by saying, the Torah says, tell your child. How do we know, even if you have no child, or if you're just talking to others? Because the Torah says, remember going out of Egypt. As it says, remember the day of Shabbos. Now, here we understand what he means. The pasuk, go out, remember the Shabbos. Shabbos doesn't say anything about requiring a child. It's a personal remembrance. So the Rambam's telling us the same way we have a remembrance. The Torah says, Zachor, Yom Shabbat, remembering Shabbos, it means remember it just for yourself. Not relevant if there's somebody else there to remember it too. Similarly, when the Torah says, Zachor et hayom hazeh, remember the day you went out of Egypt, also the Torah is telling us, just like Zachor et Yom Shabbat, even a personal remembrance is also important. So it would seem that we could say that so in the Sefer HaMitzvot, it's clear what the Rambam means. It would seem to say that maybe that's what he means also in the Mishneh Torah, in the Sefer Hayad, in the book of Halachos. Why is he bringing the pasuk Zachor Yom Shabbat to tell us that you need to remember it, even if you don't have a kid there? And we know that the Rambam brings that halacha in the Sefer Hayad, that even if you don't have a child, you still have to say it to yourself. Yeah. So maybe that's what why the Rambam brings remember the day of Shabbos, to tell us it's a generic remembrance, regardless of whether you have a child to that asks or to tell or whatever. Okay. That could be, but it can't be. You know why? Paragraph 3. It's difficult to say. By the way, the Rebbe says you could take this answer, but it's difficult to say that that's the entire reason that the Rambam adds that remembering the day of Pesach is like remembering the day of Shabbos. Because from the very language of the pasuk about remembering Mitzrayim, it doesn't say anything about a child. It just says, remember this day you went out of Egypt. Why would he assume that it's only if you have a child to tell? Yeah. So, and as we see from the very Mechilta which says one may think if I don't have a child, I don't have to remember Pesach. And the Mechilta says, no, you can't say that because the pasuk says, remember this day. It doesn't mention child. So obviously, we don't really need to talk about remembering Shabbos in order to tell us that the remembrance happens with or without a child to remember to. So in the Sefer HaMitzvahs, where the Rambam starts off, the Rambam first starts off with the concept that it's a mitzvah to tell your children about going out of Egypt. And then he says, but actually, what happens if you don't have any child? Still, you have the mitzvah to remember going out of Egypt. So in order to strengthen that, he says, just like the obligation to remember Shabbos is a personal obligation, regardless of whether you have children that will participate or not. So we understand why he brings that verse, Zachor Yom Shabbat. It adds, because in the Sefer Mitzvahs, he starts off telling us about the mitzvah to tell it to your children. That may have us think that, 1 second, if you don't have children, you don't remember Pesach. So once he's already raised that question, that we bring the correlation that says Zachor Hayom, remember the day of Pesach, and to strengthen that it means even if you're just remembering for yourself, we say just like Zachor Yom Shabbat, Shabbos you have to do regardless, not about telling someone else. However, in the Sefer Hayad, in the actual book of Mishnah Torah, so the only pasuk he brings in the first place for remembering Yetzias Mitzrayim is the pasuk Zachor Hayom Hazeh, remember this day. Why would we think he doesn't mention anything about a child in that halacha? So why would I think that it doesn't mean literally? Just remember for yourself, with child, without child, the day of Pesach. Why do I need to strengthen it by bringing by correlating it to the remembrance of Shabbos? So we could say that that's the reason, but it seems lacking to say that's the entire reason. Paragraph 4. The Migdal Oz, one of the Mefarshim on the Rambam, he brings the language of the Mechilta that we just quoted, and then he concludes that the Rambam in the book of Mitzvahs, where he writes that you have to remember the night of Pesach in its time, just like it says, Zachor Yom Shabbat. What does this mean? Here we're entering a thought that we have to have, and that is we have a mitzvah to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim, going out of Egypt, every day. We have a mitzvah to remember it on Pesach. So we could say that this is what the halacha in Sefer is trying to tell us. The Rambam learns from the pasuk Zachor Yom Hazeh, remember this day that you went out of Egypt, that there's a special, remember this day, there's a special mitzvah to talk about going out of Pesach on the day of Pesach. Beyond and besides and over the mitzvah we have to always remember. All the days of our life we have to remember going out of Egypt. That, yes, true, but there's an extra mitzvah on the day of Pesach. You know where we have the proof? That when it says Zachor, remember, it has to be on the day that it happens. Like it says, Zachor Yom Shabbat. When do we remember Shabbos? Not on Monday. We have a mitzvah to remember Shabbos on the day that Shabbos takes place, when Hashem rested. Friday night in Shabbos. Similarly, Zachor Yom Hazeh, the Rambam wants to tell us that besides the mitzvah to remember Mitzrayim every day, There's a mitzvah zachor to remember the day of Pesach, just like we remember the day of Shabbos on the day that it took place. And then the Rambam says, and how do we know that it's the night of the 15th? Because just from that verse, remember this day that he went out of Egypt, you could still say that maybe it's right when Yom Tov comes in, or maybe it's even before, maybe it's in the afternoon. You can make a Kiddush early. So he says, no, you have to do it b'shah sheyesh matzah ma'aror monachim lefanach. You have to do it at a time when there's an obligation to eat matzah mar. We know that is the night of the 15th. In other words, what we could answer here, if so, based on this Migdala, is that Zachor Tayom Hazeh is telling us that besides remembering going out of Egypt every day, we have to remember it on Pesach. How do we know that it means at the time of the going out, which is the 15th? Just like it says, Zachor Yom Shabbat, remember Shabbos. Shabbos, we have to remember the time when Shabbos takes place. But that's not enough of an answer to explain fully why the Rambam correlates it with Zachor Yom Shabbat. Why not? It could work as an answer, but nishmas, because it's not enough, really. It's not satisfying. Because according to that, so first of all, the Rambam should have brought the word like kadesho. It says Zachoret Yom HaShabbat. How do we know when to remember the day of Shabbos? We could also say there, maybe it's Tuesday. How do we know that the verse Zachoret Yom HaShabbat means to remember it on the seventh day? We know it because it says lekadesho, to sanctify it. When do we sanctify the Shabbos? Sanctification of the Shabbos we do only on the seventh day. So why doesn't the Rambam bring that last word of the pasuk, lekadesho? If he means to say that he's trying to tell us the same way Shabbos, we remember Shabbos on the day that it happens, which is the seventh day. Similarly, Pesach has to be the day that it happened, the day of going out of Egypt. So then we should have brought the real proof that the Shabbos is done the seventh day is the word lekadesho, to sanctify it. That tells us it's not just about remembering, which you can do on Wednesday. No. Remember the day of Shabbos to sanctify it. You can only make it kodesh on the actual seventh day. So why doesn't, if the Rambam is using the correlation to the mitzvah of remembering Shabbos to tell us that that's indicating that we have to remember Pesach on the day of Yitzias Mitzrayim, the word lekadesho would be paramount here. It doesn't say lekadesho. It just says, just like it says, Zachor Yom Shabbat. Also, if this pasuk, remember the day of going out of Egypt, which is like remember the day of Shabbos, is just to tell us the special mitzvah that you remember Pesach, remember going out of Egypt on the day of going out, so then the Rambam didn't at all have to bring this verse, and then remember this day you're going out of Egypt, and then bring a proof that it's just like remember the day of Shabbos, so it's talking about the day of Exodus. You could have just said, gone straight to the pasuk. You know which pasuk he could have, if that's what he's trying to say, that there's a special mitzvah to remember Pesach, the day of Pesach. Don't bring the pasuk Zachor Tayom Hazeh, which we're not sure if it means the night of Pesach. We have to bring a backup from the pasuk Zachor Tayom Shabbat, remember the Shabbos. Just go straight to the pasuk that says V'gadat alabincha bayom hu bavur. Tell your child on this night that for this is a remembrance that we do this because Hashem took us out of Egypt. What's this? This is Matzah Amar, which is on the night of the 15th. In other words, if that's the point that he's trying to prove about the obligation to do it on the night of Pesach, there's a better pasuk, not the pasuk Zachor Tayom Hazeh. We can't say that that's the full intention of the Rambam. Says the Rebbe in paragraph 5, it would seem to say that the source of the Rambam is from the Shmois Rabbah, Medrash Rabbah of Shmois, which says that the remembrance of going out of Egypt is compared to the remembrance of Shabbos. And this is his language, Zel Shono. He's Aher Yisrael, warned the Jewish people, enlightened them. Kishem Shabbarati et ha'olam v'amarti lem Yisrael yizkor Yom HaShabbat. Same way I created the world and I told the Jewish people to remember Shabbos, Zeichel L'maaseh Bereishis, is to remember the creation of the world. Shenem Zachor Yom HaShabbat, like it says, remember the day of Shabbos. Kach heyu zochrim hanisim she'asiti lechem b'Mitzrayim. Similarly, you should remember the miracles that I did for you in Egypt. V'zichru liyom she'yitzatem mishan, and remember the day you went out of there. Shenem Zachor Yom Hazeh she'yitzatem b'Mitzrayim. It says, remember this day that you went out. Okay, 1 second. So we see here the Medrash which is correlating these two. You see? We asked, where's the Rambam's source that we need to somehow connect remembering Pesach to explain to us what it means? We need to also understand Zachor Yom Shabbat, remembering Shabbos. The Rambam see. So now we have a source. Medrash Shmois Rabbah says the same way you got to talk about Shabbos. They have to remember Shabbos to remember the going out, the me making the world in 6 days or resting on the seventh. Similarly, on the day of Pesach, you have to talk about the miracles and about going out of Egypt. We're soon going to see there's two parts to it: going out and miracles. But we have to understand the Sefer of the Rambam, called the Sefer Hayat, is a Sefer that is about halacha. It's not just about quoting midrashim. So what's the halacha? In halacha, okay, we see where his source is, but what is added halachically by equating remembering Pesach, remembering Shabbos? So the explanation is as follows, says the Rabbi. In this halacha about Yitzias Mitzrayim, remembering Yitzias Mitzrayim, the Rambam wants to explain what is the difference between the remembering of going out of Egypt on the night of Pesach to the way we have to remember the going out of Egypt every single day. You could ask the basic question, which we ask every Pesach when we read the Haggadah. We say we have to sit around and have a seder, remember going out of Egypt every day. We quote the Mishnah, right? We say, all the days of our life. Every day we say, we have an obligation. So what's so different about Pesach? What's the big deal about Pesach? The night of Pesach, we have to do it differently. And this is what the Rambam is doing by comparing it to Shabbos. Because the addition to the mitzvah on the night of the 15th of Nisan is not just that every day we can just mention it. It's enough to just mention it in passing. I'm Hashem took you out. And on the 15th of Nisan, you have to talk about it with length. Like we have a big Langa Seder, right? That's not the only difference. There's also a difference in the very essence and in the very content of the remembrance. And listen now to this nuance. Every day of the year we have to remember. What does it say? We have a mitzvah to remember Yitziat Mitzrayim, the going out of Egypt. We have to remember that we left the enslavement of Egypt. On the night of Pesach, we remember not just that we went out of Egypt, but we talk about Nisim and Iflois, about the miracles and wonders that Hashem did when he took the Jews out of Egypt. Tell the story. We tell the details. We tell about the wondrous way, not just that we're out. Talk about what happened. And this we learn. How do we know about this? That there's also a concept to talk about the going out. We learn this by comparing it, as the Medrash did, to Zachor Yom Shabbat, remember the day of Shabbos. The Pasuk, it says, remember the day you went out of Egypt. We don't know what that means necessarily. It doesn't say we have to talk about the miracles and wonders. So the Rambam says when it says remember, it's just like, and we can correlate it to remember the day of Shabbos. When we remember the day of Shabbos, clearly it's about remembering Hashem's creative process. 6 days created, 7th day rested. As it says, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, Sheishet Yamim Tavod, right? Work for 6 days. And then it says, Ki Sheishet Yamim. The continuation of that verse is, for 6 days Hashem made heaven and earth, and the 7th day rested. As the Medrash said that we quoted before, right? The Medrash said the same way it's a mitzvah to remember Shabbos as a remembrance to the act of creation, 6 days of creation. Similarly, we have to remember the miracles of Mitzrayim, not just that he rested on Shabbos, but that he worked for 6 days and then he rested on Shabbos. Similarly, not just that we're out, but that there were miracles and Hashem took us out with miracles. Let's understand this a little bit deeper. Paragraph 6. A little bit deeper, we could say that the correlation in comparison to remember the day of Shabbos, that's not just a source that tells us that we have to talk about the miracles and wonders, but it's also a introduction to the ongoing laws in the continuation of this parak. By prefacing first like this, the words of the Rambam in the beginning of Shabbos go like this. And here we're going to learn something interesting about the mitzvah of Shabbos. It says, Shvita b'shvi'im mimelacha, resting on the seventh day from work, mitzvah taseh is a positive commandment. Shnemo vayom hashvi tishbot, on the seventh day you rest. Anybody who does a forbidden work, bitel mitzvah taseh, he didn't fulfill the positive commandment of resting, and he violates the negative commandment of not keeping the Shabbos. In other words, there's two things in Shabbos. There's an inyan of don't do work, isur malacha. There's an inyan of positive, shoved, mitzvah lishbot, the mitzvah to rest. But the fact that the Rambam starts off the laws of Shabbos with the positive commandment, even though if you ask somebody, what does he know about Shabbos? Mainly Shabbos is don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. The Rambam doesn't start that off. The Rambam says resting on the seventh day is a positive commandment. So we understand that the main thing about keeping Shabbos is not just the don't this, don't that, don't work. There's something positive and about Shabbos. What's the positive activity of Shabbos? Menucha, rest. So with this we see that there's also a difference in halacha, like the Rogatchover. The Goyen of Rogatchover explains that there's a difference in the nuance between the mitzvah to rest and the negative commandment not to not rest, not to do a malach. But I won't go into that. So now we can say that actually these, paragraph 7, say that these two concepts, the negative about Shabbos and the positive about Shabbos, the fact that you shouldn't do work and that you should rest, they come from two psukim that it says about Shabbos. First of all, in the creation of the world, it says, Vayishbot bayom hashvi mikol malachto asher asa. Hashem rested on the seventh day from all the work that he did. Vayivarech Elokim et yom hashvi vayikadesh oto. Hashem blessed the seventh day and he sanctified it. Ki vo shavat mikol malachto. Because then he rested from all his work. So you see clearly here, this is the day of Shvita, of resting. By Matan Torah, when Hashem gives the Torah, when he says, Zachor yom Shabbat, remember the Shabbos, he says, for 6 days Hashem made heaven and earth, and he rested on the seventh day. That's why Hashem blessed this day and he made it sanctified. In other words, on this day is special, not just that that's when the creation of heaven and earth finished, that the 6 days of creation finished the seventh day, but rather, Vayanach bayom hashvi, not just he rested and didn't do work, but Vayanach means he entered a state of deep rest, an active rest. And commensurate with that, we also have, therefore, what the meaning of Zachor Yom Shabbat, we say, remember Shabbos, is a positive thing. Not just that this day is different than other days because you can't work, but also this day has also a positive aspect to it, Menucha, as the Chazal tell us. The world was lacking rest. Shabbos came, rest came. In other words, there's a positive motion and aspect of rest that Shabbos brings with it. And we see this in the language of the Rambam when he talks about Shabbos. Remember the Shabbos with the remembrance of praise and kiddush and sanctification. So if that's the case, that there's two aspects in the Shabbos. Zachor Yom Shabbat has remember the Shabbos and stay away from work, and also do the positive activity of menucha, of rest. According to this paragraph 8, we'll explain that also the Rambam says, remember remember the day you went out of Egypt. Just like you have to remember Shabbos, there's also two aspects in remembering going out of Egypt. Just like there's two aspects in Shabbos, don't do work and rest. Same thing with Pesach. How so? The explanation is like this. By going out of Egypt, what was achieved by the children of Israel was two things. A, they stopped working. They went out of the enslavement and out of the control of the Paro regime, the Egyptian regime. The other thing that happened is they became free people. Now the Rebbe says, if you, in case we have to try and understand this a little more clearly, we know that in the laws of slaves, when there were slaves, there's two parts to a slave going out to freedom. There's when the slave is no longer enslaved to the master, he leaves his master's obligation. The next stage is when he gets full control and purchases himself, so to speak. He regains full ownership of himself. It sounds like we're trying to split a hair. Says that over here in the square brackets, we know that there's a halacha that in the Jubilee year, okay, we know that the Yovel, the Jubilee year, all servants go free. So there's an interesting halacha from in the 50th year, from Rosh Hashanah till Yom Kippur, lo hayu avadim niftarim lebatehem, the slaves couldn't go home to reclaim their own identity, but also v'lo mishtabdim ladonehem, they could not be enslaved by their masters. They were kind of in a quasi. They hung out in the master's house, eating and drinking, not working, but they also were not yet able to reclaim their complete free identity. When the Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year comes, now the servants get freed and they reclaim their own identity. So this is what the Rambam is telling us, that the same way that Shabbos has two concepts, not working and menucha and rest, similarly Pesach has two things. There's one aspect where we are no longer enslaved by Parai, and there's the other thing is where we are blessed and endowed with freedom. As the Rambam is emphasizing it right away in the next halacha, he says that even when we talk about the most basic story of going out of Egypt, as the Rambam says, when you're speaking to a ben katano tipesh, to a childish or foolish, non-sophisticated child, when you tell the child at the night of Pesach, Beni, my son, kulanu ayinu avadim k'mo shivcha zu, we were all slaves like this maidservant or this slave. That's the way we were in Egypt. And then the Rambam says, what do we tell the kid? I mean, you're speaking to a simple, unsophisticated child. You should just, no, but tell him the whole thing. What do you tell him? The continuation is, you don't just tell him, from this night we left. No, we say two parts. This night Hashem redeemed us. That's the one part. And he took us out to freedom. There's the going out, the freedom, and there's becoming imbued and endowed and gifted with a free identity. That's a separate stage. So the Rambam therefore says, because there's a stage where a person has to show his freedom, not just that he's not a slave, but also that he's free. So the Rambam says, Chayev Adam la'arot et atzmo kilo b'atzmo yatzata mishubod Mitzrayim. A person has to show himself as if he just left the slaving of Egypt, in a way that what? Kilo ata b'atzmcha hita eved, as if you yourself was a servant. V'yatzata lecheirut v'niftet, and you went out to freedom and you were redeemed. In other words, that you became a free person. And that's why it says when we eat on that night, we have to lean. Meisev derech cheirut. We have to lean like free people. By the way, we also have an obligation to drink 4 cups. No, if you get out of prison, you're not locked up. You already feel like, oh, I'm not in prison. That's not enough for Pesach. You don't have to stop working. You also have to show that you've been gifted the gift of freedom. 4 cups of wine, man. Lay back, leaning back. Not just, oh, I'm happy not to be in prison. It's an active part of freedom. The passive part of freedom is you're no longer locked up. Come Shabbos, you don't do work. That's one aspect. But then there's a deeper aspect where you actually feel that you're resting. You do things to feel restful. So that's why the Rambam, when he wants to tell us about the mitzvah to remember going out of Egypt that night, he wants to make sure we understand it's a two-pronged thing. He says, we have to remember going out of Egypt, just like it says, remember Shabbos. In other words, don't allow yourself to stop with just being satisfied with appreciating that you're no longer locked up. You also have to speak about the miracles and the wonders and the freedoms you got. Paragraph 9. We could say that what the Rambam is also taking this out of the Medrash, Because the Medrash says, the Medrash that we say is the basis of the Rambam, Medrash finishes, why should we remember this day that we went out of Egypt? Because Hashem took us out with a strong arm, strong hand. The fact that we needed to have a strong hand to get us out of Egypt, which means that we needed to have the miracles and wonders of Hashem, is not just, when we talk about remembering that on Pesach, it's not just about negating that we were no longer slaves. Because, Hashem's initial decree, that the Jewish people will be enslaved for 100 years, really what could have happened is nothing. The time comes, and all of a sudden the Egyptians dissolve, right? In other words, they were put into Egypt just for a certain amount of time. So really, that enslavement could have just finished because the time was over. But that's not what we remember. Yeah, okay, but there's a way of counting where it's 400. Hashem recounts from the time Yitzchak was. But that's not enough, just that the enslavement ends. Here we're talking about an active going out. In other words, an acting, imbuing and gifting the Bnei Yisrael with freedom. They've now become an independently free nation, which can never go back to being enslaved. This is a very big point of the Maharal of Prague, who says that we have to understand that what happened on Pesach is the Jewish people were gifted with an identity, an internal, spiritual, national identity, that it's a free people. You can lock them up after that. You can take them to inquisitions, God forbid, into concentration camps and to gulags. The Jewish. So how can you make a seder in a Siberian gulag, in a concentration camp? Or today you have Jewish prisoners. How can they make a seder and say we're free? Because you're still free. Your spirit is free. Nobody can tie up your spirit. Before that, we were slave mentality. You could take a nation. Am Yisrael was a nation that Lo Shamuel Moshe. They didn't even have the capacity to listen to Moshe Rabbeinu. They couldn't think about a different tomorrow. The moment we went out of Egypt, it's not just that the shackles were off, and now we're a nation of slaves. The state of mind, the state of our identity became Hashem gifted us cherus, 2 parts. As the Rambam emphasizes in the continuation of the Perek, that's why, although we start by talking about our humble beginnings, that we were in Egypt and we were idolatrous even for that, we finish and say that Hashem, Messiah Medata Emet, he says that Hashem gave us the Dat HaEmet, the true religion. Shekevanu Makom Lo. Hashem brought us close to Him. V'ivdilanu me'omot, He separated us from the nations. V'kervanu li'chudoi, brought us close to His oneness, to believing in His oneness. And then the Rambam continues, B'nisim v'niflaot shenaseh lanu b'cheirutenu. We remember the miracles and the wonders He did to us, and that He gave us our freedom. There's an active remembrance, not just like every day of the year we have to remember that we're no longer slaves. On Pesach we have, just like on Shabbos, and that's why he brings the correlation of Shabbos, there's an active menucha on Shabbos, there's an active freedom on Pesach that we remember. Now, says the Rebbe like this, we brought the concept of Shabbos to learn a point from. Really, if you want to look even deeper, we'll see that the model of Shabbos can actually tell us something about the Pesach. This is also a source somehow for the concept of Pesach. You see here that in the words, and by the way, says the Rabbi, we know that the Rambam also has allusions, though the Rambam didn't speak openly about Kabbalah and about Pnimiut Torah, we find that the Rambam has allusions and hints. We can find in the Rambam that shows he was privy, he was aware and well-versed in Pnimiut Torah also. For example, that the grandson of the Rambam says that his grandfather's sefer starts Yesod HaYesodot V'Amud HaChochmot is Yud Kei Vav Kei. In other words, he had hidden things that he was aware of. But the Rambam, as we know him, as his public persona, didn't deal with Kabbalah and Pnimiyut Torah. But definitely he was aware of it. It's there. So in this case, about Shabbos, when we look at what Hasidus says about Shabbos, we see that Hasidus clearly defines two levels of rest. There's the rest of the night, and then the Shabbos, the rest and the meal of the night, and then there's the rest where it is the day of Shabbos and the meal of Shabbos. At night, Shabbos is generally speaking a day that we have pleasure. V'karat ala Shabbat oneg. The concept of pleasure, the pleasure of Shabbos, there's two levels. There's the level from where the pleasure is from cessation of work. Like a person down below, when he works very hard and he vests himself into work, now he stops. Basically, what he is able to do is to withdraw back into himself. And now he has, it's relaxed. He doesn't have to. See what happens when a person works, he's projecting outwards. He's putting himself into his work, he's creative, he's doing. When he comes to Shabbos and he can sit down and stop working, what happens is really like he retreats into himself and he has pleasure. He's able to not need to exert himself outwards. That causes himself a timing, but really it's a reactive one. I don't know if it's like taking off a pair of shoes that pinching your feet. You're reacting to the no need to exert yourself in work. That's the first level of pleasure of rest. But it's still connected to work. It's still a result of your not working, which means it's still connected, affected by the work. The deeper level of pleasure is when you actually are able to enter the deep state of rest, which is not just because you stopped working, but because you're actually able to appreciate the rest. No, it's no longer related to working or not working. Now the night of Shabbos is past you, the day of Shabbos, you're able to revel and relish the rest. Not just because you're not working, but the rest itself becomes a pleasurable thing for you. It's more active kind of rest, right? And that's why there's two levels, Zachar and Shamar. We say that Shamar is Lenukva. That's a feminine level. That's connected to the night of Shabbos. In general, that's the light of Hashem that's called Memalek Olamim, that's vested in the world, that's immanent in the world. And that's why the 6 days of the week, that light comes down in a contracted way to be able to engage in the world. The night of Shabbos, the concealment of that light is moved away and it can be revealed, and that's why there's holiness in Shabbos. The next and deeper level is Zachar, remember, which Kabbalistically is Dechura, is masculine. Masculine is always considered more strong. That's the level of the day of Shabbos, which is a revelation of a higher level, the transcendent light of Hashem, which is higher from being divided or enclosed in any form of creative activity. So that relates to Menucha Be'etzem, the essential state of rest. Not just rest from not working, but rest in its deepest essential state. That's why we find that from all the holidays of our calendar, the only one that's called Shabbos is Pesach. Right? It says, Mimocharas HaShabbos. You should count. Start the Sfirat HaOmer the day after Shabbos. Really means the day after Pesach. Okay. Yeah. Mimocharat HaShabbat, Tisperu 50 Yom. Doesn't mean on Sunday. It means Mimocharat HaPesach. So we know that Shabbos is called Pesach. Pesach is called Shabbos. Why? Because if we understand now that Shabbos is a level which contains also the highest level of Memalek Olamim, it also contains a level which is not just stopping work, which is Memalek Olamim, but it's a level also of Menucha Be'etzem, a level of Sovev Olamim, the transcendent light. We can now understand that that's also where the miracles of the redemption of Pesach, it's the same level. We're talking higher than nature, same concept, different names. And this is what the Rambam says, that on Pesach we have to talk about the nisim and iflot, the miracles and wonders which were done to our forefathers in Egypt, as it says, remember this day, and as the Rambam says, as it says, remember the day of Shabbos, because the positive commandment that he's telling us, to remember the miracles and wonders of going out of Egypt, you know where we have this concept from. You know where that level is? That level is in the remembering of the day of Shabbos. From the fact that we have the instruction to get to the deeper level of rest on Shabbos, which is a level higher than world. Oh, when that level manifests in the world, you know how that level comes down to the world? Like miracles and wonders. Where are miracles and wonders coming from? They're from the level of Hashem that's transcendent. Nature comes from the level of Hashem that's immanent, that fills the world. So he says you have to remember going out of Egypt the same way you have to remember the Shabbos. The same way the Shabbos has a deeper level of rest. Similarly, on Pesach, besides just talking about the fact that we're no longer in chains, no, we have to talk about the miracles and wonders, the fact that Hashem gifted us with an intrinsic freedom that can never be taken from us. And that's the ultimate of the freedom that's given to the Eden, that not just they're not servants, they're free people. Because where does this kind of freedom come from? From the world of Shabbos. What is Shabbos? The level of Shabbos is Alma de Cheiru, so the world of freedom. Shabbos is above world. When you come from that space, you can't have enslavement. So the Bnei Yisrael were lifted higher than Mitzrayim, higher than limitations, higher than the order of descent.
But the Keter?
Similar to Keter, higher than Ishtalshus. And the completion of this will be when the future redemption comes, Mashiach will come, then there'll be a Cheiru Segula Mitis, a complete and authentic freedom, redemption. And then there'll also be miracles and wonders like there were, but in a revealed way. As it says, like the days I took you out of Egypt, I'll show you wonders. Especially, it's going to be then what's the day that's called Yom Shekolosh Shabbatim Nuchal Chayei Olamim, a day that's completely Shabbos and rest for all times. So we have here the beautiful, to sum it up, just in several words, the Rambam telling us, hinting to us that we have to remember the going out of Egypt the same way we have to remember going out of Shabbos, which tells us that there's two aspects to it. There's the technical aspect, we're no longer slaves, like the technical aspect, we stop working, but then there's the deeper aspect where there's a positive rest on Shabbos, and there's a positive gift of freedom on Pesach, which is accompanied by miracles, wonders, and a gift of freedom that can never be taken from us. It's ours forever. That's why Pesach is a Yom Tov that we have ever since then, no matter what our external conditions are. This is the Sikha in general.